Prince of Persia: Warrior Within is an action-adventure game released in 2004, in a similar vein to other titles like Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. Speaking of The Sands of Time, there have been a few changes between this game and that one, and those changes can be summarized with one word: aggression. Everything is more aggressive now. The enemies, which bleed now, the prince, the art direction, the environments, the trap placement, pretty much everything. It's pretty clear that we're not in some mythical palace anymore. We're in God's country now. Godsmack's country. It does have its quiet moments, and I actually think it's a little bit better than The Sands of Time, but it's definitely a product of its age, and it was pretty decisive when it came out, even to the creator of the franchise. It is also nearly twice as long as its predecessor, which means twice as much game to cover this time around. So let's go ahead and get started. The process for getting started is very similar to how the first game does it. I'll post a link that should point you to everything you need, but if you want a guide on how to get it all set up, just watch part of my first video. Thankfully, your controller works in the menus, and you're able to pause with it, but I did encounter an additional issue. If you try to move in a diagonal direction, the prince will start walking instead of running. The solution to this is pretty simple. You just need to increase your gamepad sensitivity to something like 1.75. You can lower it or raise it if you want, but you can only lower it so much before it becomes an issue again. And that's pretty much it for getting started. It's the same engine with mostly the same flaws, just a different coat of paint. A very different coat of paint. If the billion traps placed everywhere don't make you feel unwelcome, everything else sure will. No longer are we in a palace full of enemies that were once human, in a place that might have at one point been called inviting. Here, everything is hostile and brutalist, and it all serves one purpose: to do the bidding of the empress you've come here to kill. So what does that mean for you, the player? Well, unfortunately, that means you're going to be staring at a lot of grays and browns. Okay, so that might be hyperbole. There's still plenty of colors here, especially red, but they're all pretty muted. It almost feels like color put on eyeliner and started shopping at Hot Topic. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the environmental art. For the most part, the art direction ranges from dark and moody to dark, moody, and decrepit. There are some subtleties that shouldn't be dismissed though, even if everything looks as grim as this. For starters, the game is both non-linear and has time travel mechanics, which I'm sure the artist had to account for. They took a lot of care in accounting for the where and the when of the places you'll visit, and all the sections of the palace feel connected, yet unique. It's just some nice visual design, especially when you're jumping back and forth between parts of the palace like this. The environments aren't the only things that have gotten gloomy either. The prince has also had some changes made as well. For starters, his outfit is a lot more practical. Except for the sash, I don't know what that's about. He's dirtier looking and his hair's more unkempt. He looks ravaged rather than regal. He also has a tribal tattoo now. Like your Game Boy. And I have to talk about his face. It looks fine in the pre-rendered cutscenes, but in-game it looks a bit more... intense. It also looks like it animates worse, but we'll get to that in a minute. Aside from the additional fan service added to the game, the enemy models have had some moderate changes as well. The most notable change is that instead of being these big, bulking monstrosities made of sand, they kind of just look like normal people. Just to be clear, they are still made of sand, and bizarrely, very bizarrely, out of blood as well. I guess so it looks cooler when you bifurcate them every which way. The audio and the animations make it seem like they have more intelligence, so maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. Rule of cool applies here, I guess. And I've tried to go as long as I can without saying this, but yes, the enemy designs are much edgier compared to the first game. I will give the game credit for having different designs for the higher ranked enemies, instead of just palette swapping them. I like the designs of the newer, unique enemies, like the dude who's made out of birds, but there is a guy made out of shadows and spikes who throws knives at you, and somehow that's not even as edgy as the design choices go. As for the animation, I think it's an overall improvement, with some flaws. Since the game's combat is a lot more fleshed out this time around, a ton of animations were added, and they all look really clean and stylish. They play well into the prince's acrobatic skills, and they have some real weight behind them now that you have to pull combos off to see them. The enemies are less readable now given their newfound aggression, but I think their animation work was done well enough. Basically all of the prince's acrobatics animation was copied one-to-one from the first game, so no notes there. Although I do like this little flourish he does when he jumps off of a banner. The animation does have some issues, although I believe these are technical in nature rather than design flaws. For example, the game really doesn't like it if you try to drink water with your weapons out. Aside from the occasional animation bug, there were also some visual bugs I encountered as well, like spikes not retracting fully into the ground and enemies walking through bars like they were Robert Patrick. There are also some visual effect issues that I'm sure are tied to the frame rate, but we'll get into the frame rate's bigger issues later. There is a new visual effect the game really likes to use, and that would be the slow motion camera. It'll usually play when you pull off a combo or execute someone or really do anything cool in combat. Like I said, the word of the day is aggression, so if this is too much for you, I'd knock it down a level or two. Whenever the slow-mo pops off, it'll also slow down the music and the sound effects. It sounds alright on the music, but it doesn't really do the sound effects any favors. Although some would say the music doesn't really need any help sounding bad, and those people are lame. Okay, so let me be objective for a minute here. I won't say the music is any better or worse than the first games, but it is definitely different. It leans a lot more into the stereotypical rock band sound. Dad rock, one might call it. It feels like the songs between this game and the first one carry a lot of the same DNA, but it feels tonally different because of all the overdriven guitars and crunchy bass.
Let's finish him. Down! Down! How dare you confront me! You should...
I'd still go to bat for the music in this game, but it definitely didn't help allay any fears that the game was taking a grittier approach. I should mention that Stuart Chatwood is back to do the music, and regardless of whether or not you like it, it still does match the tone of the game quite well. Now, aside from the stuff Stu did, and the licensed music from Godsmack, some of the tracks in the game are also done by Hainan Zur, who you might know from Fallout 3. Now, as far as I understand, the work he did was delegated to the cutscenes only and maybe a boss battle or two. It has an orchestral nature to it, which contrasts very nicely with the heavy metal in-game stuff. It's not all headbanging craziness though. The game introduced exploration tracks, which are much more subdued than the combat themes. There's not much to them, it's more ambience than anything, but they fill in the gaps between set pieces quite well. The last descriptor you'd probably use on this game is relaxing, but I think the exploration tracks breathe a lot of life into the game. The music's not without its flaws, and I don't mean whether or not I think it's bad. Like the animations, these are more technical in nature. Regardless of whether or not you like the music, the game really likes the music, so much so that it has trouble letting go. It happens more often than not that you'll hear the combat music playing, even though everyone's been dead for a while. I'm not exactly sure why this happens, maybe an environmental trigger or something, but it becomes less engaging when you're just hanging off a ledge. Something I think is 100% a technical issue is the fact that, on occasion, the game will skip tracks. That's not great, but it only happened in this one spot, which I can't show to you yet because of spoilers, sorry, so I guess I can live with it. Speaking of bugs, how does the prince not have a parasite from some of the water he drinks? He could even drink seawater now. Speaking of the prince, he's a lot more talkative now during combat. In fact, everyone is. The prince and friends have a lot more to say during combat now, thanks to a whole slew of new combat perks.
You have earned yourself many enemies this day.
It ends for you, as it has for all those who have come before!
Do as you are told, and kill him! My abilities could be put to better use.
The combat dialogue the prince has makes him seem downright bloodthirsty, which he probably is, but at least the stuff the enemies have give him a bit of a personality. Except the assassins. I hate the assassins' dialogue.
I love being so close to you.
What are you talking about? You're way over there. A lot of the voices seem to have this sort of modulation effect added to them, and it just makes them sound compressed, which is whatever. That's pretty much all I got for audio. The soundscape had to be dialed back because of the ambient soundtracks, and the sound effects are basically just imported from the first game. They were fine then, they're fine now. Of course, if we want to find something that's been overhauled from the first game, we don't need to look any further than the combat system. Say what you want about the tone, but the combat is leaps and bounds above the Sands of Times. It builds off what the first game had, and there's so much more you can do now. For starters, pretty much all the moves from the first game are still here. You can still do flips and slash with your sword and block, but by simply moving the sand powers over to a separate item, now you can dual wield, and this changes a lot. The most obvious thing to point out is the rather large combo list, although you can basically only do any of these if you have 2 weapons. Finding another weapon is rarely a problem though, as every enemy will drop a weapon, sometimes more than 1 weapon. You'll also find these weapon racks everywhere, and they hold more powerful weapons than your standard fare, sometimes really powerful. I feel like this should be red. You can do a few of the combos just by button mashing, but the combat here goes a lot further than its predecessor, thanks in large part to the new moveset. Combos aren't the only thing that have been added. The prince's acrobatic skills have been upgraded to better suit the combat as well. In addition to jumping off of enemies and jumping off of walls, now you can do Izuna drops off of walls, or flip enemies over you, or flip over enemies, or do this incredibly long move where you just sit there and twist the enemy's spine over and over. A lot of these are the inverse of the combo skills, meaning that you can only do a lot of them with a single weapon. So you're kind of switching between the combos and the acrobatic skills. The core of your combat skill switching between these 2 states like this keeps things fresh, but more importantly, I never found it unfun. Your opponents are a lot more aggressive and a lot less readable this time around, so you have to be smart about what moves you make. Thankfully, the new parry system makes dealing with them just a bit easier. Parrying is much simpler now. All you have to do is block and wait for this sound effect, and then press either attack button and you're good. If you miss, the enemy has plenty of time to retaliate, and there's no guarantee that they won't jump in the middle of your animation. You basically want to spend as little time as possible being surrounded, especially by the assassins. I hate the assassins. Also, given that the new enemies are more intelligent and humanoid in nature, I'd expect plenty of ambushes. Outside of combat, your explorative, wall running skills haven't really been upgraded much. There's a couple of new things you can interact with, but they're not really worth going over. It still feels fun to run around in the environment, so why fix something that isn't broken? Of course, given that basically every environment is 90% traps, you'll be putting your wall running skills to the test. There are so many more traps in this game compared to the first one. If you're not in combat, chances are very good that you're dodging traps. They're not randomly strewn about though. You actually have to put some thought into how to navigate them, especially in the last half of the game. To that effect, you'll probably be using your sand powers more frequently this time around, and thankfully they are much more useful now, both in combat and out of it. Recall is helpful as always, but this time around your haste actually does something because now you actually move faster than everything else. This is nice to have in combat, but it's very helpful when you're dodging traps and sometimes even essential for a couple areas. You don't have a lot of sand slots to work with at first, but you get your sand back pretty easily, so it's fine. You get more time slots and more combat-centric powers by making it further into the game. This means that you won't have to hunt down sand orbs anymore to upgrade your power capacity. This is a shame if you were looking for a more explorative experience, but I guess it's fine if you're just focused on combat. There are still collectibles to be had though, the most important ones of course being your life upgrades. These upgrades are much more difficult to get to now. Not only are the entrances better hidden, but the pathways to get to them look like this. Outside of the life upgrades, there's also these treasure chests that are strewn about, which don't really do anything for you in game, but unlock stuff like concept art. And that's pretty much all I've got before story time. There's going to be some spoilers obviously, and for those of you who are spoiler intolerant, you can skip to here to see my closing thoughts. Okay, so starting out the story is pretty simple. The prince is back in Babylon, and he's being chased by something. I'm willing to write this scene off as a vision, because it looks pretty desperate at the end, but the prince just ends up in the middle of the ocean, so I don't know. It's not long before the prince's boat is jumped by a bunch of sand ghouls and the woman in black leading them, who's not wearing much more than what you can see on screen right now. After fighting some ghouls, the prince gets his butt kicked in a cutscene, even though he was winning during the fight. Why do games do this? He ends up in the ocean, and we flash back to when the prince had a meeting with an old man in the middle of the desert. This meeting reveals a lot, including the prince's motivations for this quest and what exactly is after him. Basically, the prince opening the hourglass that contained the sands of time in the first game was a really bad idea. Because he didn't die as a result of opening the hourglass, the guardian of the timeline is after him. The guardian, also known as the Dahaka, is relentless and will stop at nothing to kill the prince. And it basically looks like what would happen to a minotaur if it was sent through the shimmer. Anyway, even after being told that his fate is unchangeable, the prince is determined to go back in time and stop the sands from ever being made. Things aren't looking good for the prince though when he washes up on the beach. All his men are dead, and all he has is a crummy piece of driftwood for a weapon. After a little bit of exploring the island, the woman in black ambushes the prince, but he manages to drive her off back into this desecrated palace. The prince catches up with her, and in chasing her, unwittingly takes one of these time portals, which takes him back to the past. After getting clowned on by her again, the prince decides to chase her even further. These time portals keep things interesting, because now not only does where you are matter, but when you are matters. Going back to the past also means that the traps are newer and therefore more operational than their present counterparts. Eventually though, entire trap layouts will change depending on what state of time you're in. Anyway, the prince continues to pursue the woman in black, and after passing through this large chamber, encounters her tangling with another woman, who doesn't have a name, but I'm just going to go ahead and spoil it and say her name's Kylina. I don't want to sit here and call her the woman in red until she tells us her name, that would be stupid. After killing the woman in black, which feels a little early but whatever, the prince tries to seek an audience with the empress from Kylina. She's not having any of it though, and she tells the prince to go back or else. After deciding to go with or else, the prince pursues her back into a chamber where the hourglass is being stored. After the prince meets up with the Kylina, she tells him that if he wants an audience with the empress, he'll have to undo the very foundations of the castle, which in reality just means he'll have to go to a couple of towers and pull some levers. This is where the castle opens up and the game becomes non-linear. I really enjoy it when games open up like this and let you basically just poke around until you're ready to go. Assuming there's stuff to do, of course. And what are your tasks? Well, it's pretty simple. You have to go to these two towers, the clockwork and the garden tower, and activate the mechanisms within. I usually start with the garden tower because it's the prettiest and I think it makes the most sense to start there. And I also hate fighting these dog things. Along the way, you'll encounter some new variations of enemies and hopefully some life upgrades. And the entire time, the prince will be grittily muttering to himself.
So Babylon is not the only place to discover the wonders of hanging gardens. Ours, however, do not provide sanctuary to monsters.
After carving your way through hordes of enemies and running around the gardens, you'll eventually make it to the mode activation tower. This is also the only point in the game where I encountered a frame rate bug that would actually lock me out of progression. So basically the way this area works is you want to rotate these towers so they drop water into these channels, but you need to rotate it so it's pointing towards this pole so you can get up to the actual lever. The problem is that when you try to wall run up this thing, you sort of hitch on this little section in the middle. So every time I try, wait, what? It worked? But I spent 20 minutes on this on my first playthrough. I thought it was just me until I found out it was a frame rate issue. Why did it work this time? Ugh, anyway, if this happens to you for whatever reason and your frame rate's too high, just try capping it at 60 or something. Once you activate the moat, you want to head back to the central chamber so you can move over to the mechanical tower. Bizarrely, the moat is the only source of water you can't drink in this game. After making his way back to the central area, the prince meets up with Kylina once again, and she gives him a sword. Although she admires his determination in trying to change his fate, she doesn't think he can actually do it. Pfft, whatever. In the mechanical tower, you'll encounter two new types of enemies, the titans, which really aren't that hard if you have haste, and the dogs, which really aren't that fun. Okay, they're not really that bad, but I can never seem to block them, and unless you're dodging out of the way, the explosion does a ton of damage to you as well. The titans are still pretty easy though. Anyway, while he's in the tower, the prince has a couple more encounters with the Wraith. Oh, right, the Wraith, I should have brought him up earlier. Pretty much since the start of his time in the palace, the prince has come across this shadowy Wraith creature on occasion, and it doesn't seem hostile, or at least not actively pursuing him. Just throw it on the mystery pile, I guess. One thing that is actively pursuing you is the Dahaka, and you'll usually encounter him in certain parts of the castle during the present. He summons Godsmack during his chases, and there's not really anything you can do to stop him. His chases, I mean, not the Godsmack part. I found him pretty unnerving as a kid, and he still activates some part of my lizard brain when I can hear him running behind me but I can't see him. Some more killing and exploring, and it's not long before you activate the mechanical tower's mechanism. That should have opened the gate, so it's time to go back to the hourglass chamber and confront the Empress. When the prince gets there, he meets up with Kylina once again.
Time is running low. You ready? I've been thinking, Kylina. There is little for you on this island, and there will be less still once I've stood before your mistress. Come with me to Babylon. You'll have a chance to begin a new life, free from the evils of this place.
I'm sorry, Prince, but I cannot take you up on your offer.
Okay, surely he'll make the connection this time. After entering the next room, one of the two big plot twists in this game happens. The Empress is revealed to be Kylina. The fact that the prince is shocked by this erodes any hope I had of him not being a giant blockhead. Anyway, the prince kills her in combat. It's real sad, but he had to do it to change his fate. He starts to look for a way off the island, except he didn't change his fate, because the Dahaka is still after him. It chases him into this catacomb area, where he realizes that by killing the Empress, he himself has accidentally created the Sands of Time. After wallowing in despair for a bit, the prince stumbles upon a way to go back even further in time using something called the Mask of the Wraith. And yeah, that's the second big spoiler. The Wraith is actually the prince from a future time. With renewed vigor in his heart, the prince sets out to change his fate once and for all. After finding the mask and after going through a very painful looking sequence, he becomes the Sand Wraith. However, there is a giant lingering problem on the horizon. Something I didn't mention earlier is that in the past, right before you confront the Empress, the Dahaka shows up. The Wraith shows up at the exact same time, and after dodging out of the way, the Dahaka kills the Wraith and then leaves. The prince realizes all of this himself, and it's safe to assume that he's on a death timer. The mechanics of the Sand Wraith are interesting. Basically, your health will reduce until it reaches about a quarter of your inner life bar, but you get regenerating sand powers, so there's no reason not to just spam recall when you take damage. After being harassed by the Dahaka some more and traveling through some old familiar areas, that's always fun. The Wraith Prince finally makes it to the moment of truth. And he lives? I feel like that's a paradox of some kind, but whatever. The mask falls off, and the prince confronts Kylina once again, except this time going straight for the throne. So the prince figures that if he can kill the Empress in the present, after the events of the first game transpire, the sands will never be created and he can get the Dahaka off his back. So here's where the game diverges. That's right, there's multiple endings. The bad ending is that the prince kills the Empress once again, and all traces of the Sands of Time are erased. The good ending requires that you get a special sword called the Water Sword by collecting all the life upgrades. Those might have been more important than you thought. Hope you've been finding them. Anyway, with the Water Sword you can kill the Dahaka, which seems like it should have some dire consequences for time, but, you know, whatever. Because of this, Kylina and the prince both escape their fates, and they make their way back to Babylon. While the two of them naked wrestle on a bed on their way back to Babylon, it seems the city's being sacked by a dark prince, and that leads into the next game. A lot of people might write this game off as just the edgy middle child of the trilogy, but I think it was a massive step up in terms of gameplay. I still like how everything looks and sounds, but I know tastes may differ. I think the story is interesting enough to get me through the game, but honestly I think the combat alone is worth 8 to 10 hours of playtime. Prices on GOG range between cheap and very cheap, so if you liked even a little bit of the gameplay footage, I'd recommend picking up a copy. And that's it for Prince of Persia: Warrior Within. Hopefully I'll have my Halloween special Double Trouble review done, before Halloween. Hopefully by the end of the year I'll also have Riven done, and obviously I'm going to finish up the Prince of Persia trilogy. I would have liked to have had this out earlier, but between Deadlock Fever and the Halloween double review, I'd like to quicken my review pace, but it was just not going to happen this time. That's all I've got. Thank you for watching. Until next time.